So, today I woke up and decided to choose violence by talking about white men on the internet, specifically through the lens of Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America by Ijeoma Oluo. Now, if you're familiar with that name, it's because she wrote the best-selling book So You Want to Talk About Race. However, this is my first experience with her writing, and let me tell you, I'm a fan. So, yes, I understand that this cover and this title is pretty provocative, and so to give you an idea of what the context of this book is actually about, you have a kind of historical review, but also current cultural commentary on the various ways in which white male leadership is often prioritized despite the failings, despite the unethical, immoral behavior of previous white male leaders. But then when it comes to people of color or women or people from different backgrounds, they're often not given the chance to lead until a company or an organization is already floundering. And if they are dismissed, they're often dismissed publicly in ways that are far more aggressive than individuals who, embezzled funds or assaulted employees. In addition, this book goes to all the way back to the Wild West, the concept of manifest destiny and the role of white male masculinity when it came to slaying the savage American Indian and taking the lands for God and country. She also talks about the role of Ivy League education and how the Ivy Leagues originally were not just for white men, but were for wealthy white families, and how the role of education and the perception of higher education has evolved now that more and more of us lower and middle class people, and by lower and middle class I mean truly just not the 1%, have found a way into colleges, how that has evolved. She talks about the concept of muscular Christianity, this idea that men have to be virile and strong and tough, and they have to be able to continue conquering or maintain the conquered resources and lands that their forefathers did. So they need to be playing football, they need to be going out west and learning how to ride horses. Their religious faith has to be connected to their form of masculinity. And of course she talks about all of the damage that this very oppressive idea of patriarchy, this idea that men can only act a certain way, that men aren't allowed to have emotions, that men aren't allowed to express themselves, specifically white men, in ways that in any way even remotely challenge the structures that be, how that often leads in young white men, in working class white men, anger, resentment, and disillusion. And unfortunately, so many of those people, we know that 70% of mass shooters in the United States are white men. We know that the highest rates of completed suicide in the United States are white men. This is destructive. This is literally killing white men and killing others because of white male rage, and yet so many of us are not talking about it. And something I found really, really interesting was the way that she definitely explored her own personal frustration with the idea of constantly having to center white men, constantly having to try to deflate working class rage when it's manipulated by politicians at communities that have nothing to do with, working class plights in specific areas. The way that she is so clearly resentful, and understandably so, of saying, why do we constantly have to center, coddle, constantly have to educate, constantly have to challenge young white men or working class white men when they are the ones who are often perpetuating these systems that not only harm themselves, but harm others. And I read this book before watching FD Signifier's video on Dissecting the Manosphere, but I would highly recommend watching them / reading that in tandem, because there is so much he is discussing in that book. There are so many interviews there's so much he's discussing in that video. There's so many interviews he has in that video with young white men who talk about the disillusionment and the nihilism that led them to the alt-right, or the feelings of loneliness and ostracization that made them feel that the only place that they could feel safe was in communities that were actively putting down other people. The way in which mental health, oh my gosh, is yes a huge issue in this country for all backgrounds, but when it comes to this idea of asking for help being seen as vulnerability, and vulnerability automatically being seen as feminine or weak, how that absolutely fucks with people, specifically men, when they're told that asking for help is an unmasculine feminine thing. When boys are told not to cry, to stop acting like a wuss, to stop acting like a pussy, how damaging that is to these boys and men, and also how damaging it is to the people who come in contact with them when they do not have the skills, resources, or practice in managing their own emotions. And something that I felt while reading this book, while watching Dissecting the Manosphere, and just interacting with some of these people in real life is I feel torn. On one hand, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Each of us has a limited amount of time, energy, and resources in a day, but also in our lives. Do I personally want to spend the majority of my anti-racist practice trying to gently educate white men in a way that doesn't upset their ego, in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're the bad guy, in a way that helps them see me and other people of color and other queer people as human and not as enemies that are taking away resources or taking away opportunities? Is that really how I want to be spending my life? Or would I rather invest it in communities that I feel are suffering even more because of the same issues that white men are dealing with and the issues that white men are then perpetuating? Or do I want to spend my time and energy working in spaces where education is not coming at the cost of challenge? And I say that because I am constantly navigating how I choose to interact with specifically racism and sexism when it comes from white men. Whether I'm in a situation where I don't physically feel safe addressing it, whether I don't have the emotional and mental energy and I just want to ignore it, whether I think the best course is to pull them aside privately and try to explain something to them in a way that doesn't embarrass them, or whether I'm like, no, what this person just said or did is explicitly harmful and it is affecting multiple people in this group. So I need to be like, hey, we don't use that word for people of color. Or, hey, I really think that we need to shift the tone of this conversation because now we're starting to get combative. It's so complicated. And I feel like, frankly, any decision that an individual makes, especially someone who's dealing with multiple intersections of privilege and oppression, has to be respected in some way. Like, I'm not going to knock an individual for saying, I don't want to spend my life explaining microaggressions. The same way I'm not going to knock an individual who won't let anything slide, because why should they have to? So that's a bit of a slight tangent and less a review of this physical book, which I will say is quite well written, taught me so much about, again, muscular Christianity, the origins of American football and how it ties into like white male strength, the way that Teddy Roosevelt kind of became a poster child for a particular type of American ruggedness despite coming from a very wealthy, bougie, upper class family, and the ways in which there have been organized campaigns. I had no idea about this. Organized campaigns of white men claiming that they're going to commit suicide because that's obviously what all women, all black people, all people of color, all queer people, all disabled people want, that white men should just be erased, so they're just gonna kill themselves and it'll be all of our fault. Like, I didn't even know that there were people organizing these emails and DMs and campaigns to authors like this, to other authors and creators online, saying, you clearly want all white men dead, and so we're all gonna kill ourselves. And it's like, how did we get here? Like, who said that? Like, and again, violence, so much violence that comes from this oppressive patriarchal culture. So I feel like this is less of a book review and more of me saying that this book, I feel, connects very heavily to Dissecting the Manosphere by F.D. Signifier. I feel like both of these pieces of art connect to The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. The whole point of The Sum of Us was that we are stronger together than we are apart. And Heather McGhee went through history, modern times, and explained examples of how this is going to happen in the future, of white communities rather choosing to do things that hurt themselves rather than share resources, or rather than it be in any way supportive of equality. One of the big examples that she uses in The Sum of Us is that of a swimming pool. There was a point in American history, I had no idea about this, where beautiful, large public swimming pools were common across the country. They were originally supposed to be places where people, specifically white people, from various classes could join together, could cool off, could connect as a community. And all across the country, as opposed to embracing or accepting integration, these pools were drained and filled in with cement. And that idea of I'm willing to cut off my own foot to make sure that someone else can't walk a step I perceive to be further than me is something that's happening all throughout American history. Yes, has happened with a variety of groups, but this book specifically also talks about the ways in which working class white men and wealthy white men are doing it to themselves. And it just drives me insane, because when you can't convince someone to act in their own best interest because they're so afraid that someone else will rise above them in the hierarchy, or it's so difficult for them to challenge the beliefs that they were raised with, that capitalism works best for everyone, that there's a specific way men need to act in order to really be men and anything else is less than, that the natural order of things is a very, very small group of people at the top in terms of political power, financial power, resources, and everyone else struggling below, it just becomes like this funhouse mirror mindfuck of conversations and analysis and academic articles and Twitter arguments, because I can see so many different sides of this, so many different ways in which individuals could say, here's what we can do to help white men. Here's what we can do to help the people that white men hurt. Here's what we can do to further education. Here's what we need to do to push forward specific progressive policies. And all of these things are connected. All of these things are connected, and that is a beautiful thing, because I think it speaks to the human condition, but also sometimes an exhausting, overwhelming thing. So this is, as I said before, less of a review and more of a public processing, but I would very much recommend this book for what you learn about American history, what you learn about white masculinity and Christianity, and also for some really, really impactful and painful personal stories about people navigating white supremacy, including the author. And it's a good mix of larger cultural commentary and some of these individual stories that kind of bring out the human emotion and bring out the heart. And one of my favorite things about interacting with media, about reading stories, about watching video essays, is when I can start seeing connections and when I can start seeing ways in which these ideas coalesce, even when these people aren't literally having conversations with each other. Like Heather McGhee and Oluo and FD Signifier, I know we're not sitting around in a coffee house or a coffee shop being like, here's how we're all going to discuss the online manosphere and the alpha male podcast and working class white rage being manipulated by politicians, the way that white supremacy and patriarchy hurts people that allegedly benefited from it and also hurts people who definitely don't benefit from it, and how as Black people, Black authors, Black creators, we're trying to hold space for both of these things. I know that's not literally happening, but that's one of my favorite things about kind of engaging with as much media and writing and work as possible to try to make these connections. So I hope something in this video resonated with you. I hope this encouraged you to pick up this particular book, pick up The Sum of Us, go watch the FD Signifier video. I know it's long, watch it in chunks, you'll be fine. But I'm really, really latched onto this idea right now. I'm really, really trying to figure out, one, what is my role in all this as someone who deeply loves and cares for certain cis white men in my life and sees some of these inklings in terms of like expectation about what the world should be, and also someone who works in anti-racist spaces and has seen some incredible moments and where white men's minds were changed and their actions were changed afterwards, but also have run into so many brick walls. And like, how many times can I smash my face against something? Like, how long does the blood need to be in my eyes before I'm like, maybe I should try a different approach? So all that being said, hope this gives you something to chew on, and I will see you next time. Bye.